Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with a return guest, Dr. James Cortada. I'm leaving a link to our first interview in the description box of this one, which was about his book, Fake News Nation. And today we're focusing on his latest book, Birth of Modern Facts: How the Information Revolution Transformed Academic Research, Governments and Businesses. So, Dr. Cortada, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for inviting me back.
So, we're talking about essentially information today and how it changed across time and how different people deal with information and contributed to how we process it, basically. So perhaps let's start with the definition or how you approach the topic here. So what is information?
Interesting conversational topic, because there are many definitions of information. In fact, people who study this subject are debating among themselves what it is. But for me, information really boils down to two things. One is that over the last 2 centuries, people have seen facts as tools. I need to know what the temperature is outside so that I know whether to wear a jacket, a sweater, or a t-shirt. So that's a tool.
Yeah.
The second part of this is that it's an object. Your name is Ricardo. It's a reality. It's a thing. It may not have a physical touch to it like a piece of wood or metal, but it exists. It exists in your mind. It exists in my mind. Ricardo is a reality. And it has, along with it, a number of features. It's attached to a specific human being. It is a cultural statement because you might not be called Ricardo if you were Chinese, but you would be if you were Portuguese or an American. So it has features to it. So it has many of the features of a physical object. Now, it comes in different forms. A piece of data, for example, or datum, as they say, could be number 9. Data could be a row of numbers, right? Or a list of names, like all your relatives. It can also be, information can also be a collection of various types of data, which allow you to understand a situation. So it could be a combination of Ricardo is a Portuguese blogger who is one of 330,000 bloggers in the world, and they represent a major source of information for people around the world. Mm-hmm. So you get context as part of that story as well. So it has these various elements, and it's portable. It can also be wisdom in the sense of I can come back and say, well, after 50 years of studying information, I have learned 3 or 4 things about how people treat information. So it can be very explicit. Today's temperature is 11 centigrade. It can be very tacit. Portuguese people tend to be very friendly. Yeah, so it goes the other extreme. Mm-hmm. So those are some features of the definition of information. The key here is that people know it when they see it. It's like pornography. You know it when you see it. You know what information is. Even when it's bad information, when your neighbor tells you a story that's not true about somebody down the street, it's still information.
Right. But, does the nature of information change over time? Does the way people understand what information is about change over time? And, basically the thing itself, information, changes over time or not?
It really has, and that's why I wrote the book. One of the reasons why we've had the Industrial Revolution of the last 200 years was because we had new information that was invented, discovered, applied, different situations. So, for example, when somebody invented steam engines, they had to know a certain amount about what steam does, how you convert water to steam, and then how to put it in a pressurized container, which then could force a machine part to move back and forth. And that led to engines that would allow, for example, better mining of coal, which then created more cheap energy, which then could drive other machines, and then people learned, right? And so this is how you got the Industrial Revolution. Computer chips. Somebody learned how to invent the computer chip, and then they made it even better and better and better and better. Lithium batteries, the same thing, right? So over the last 200 years, we have seen several things happen with information. We went from generalized things, generalized information about, say, agriculture or the weather or politics, to more precise, better organized, what we call scientific information. That was more detailed about more topics than before. That's the first thing. The second thing is that people began to realize that, or to accept that numeric definitions were more useful. So knowing that the temperature outside is 9 degrees centigrade is more useful than knowing that it's warm or cold. Because as scientific information changed, we know that, for example, water behaves differently at 11 centigrade than at 9 centigrade, and therefore you can do different things with water at each temperature, right? So information became more precise, what we like to think of as more numeric, and also more scientific, okay? The next thing that happened was that because we used the scientific methods of collecting information, we were able to organize it better. So we have more precise categories of information. I like to think of it as disciplining and organizing information. So we have information about history, economics, political science, physics, chemistry, mathematics, space. This continues all the time. And once you organized information, then you could identify people who were experts on those specific pieces of information. And using methods of scientific research, they could add to that collection. And as you added to that collection, what did you do? You added more tools that people could use. So a farmer in 1700 had to worry about how the animals and the crops behaved based on observation. By 1900, that same farmer could get a university degree in agriculture. And by 1950, would know that he should harvest his crop a certain number of days after it's been growing, because they'll have more nutrients in the crop. And that would be better for his animals and obviously for the public. So you can see how that changed over time. And once you started having experts, then they created social structures, academic departments in universities, associations of farmers and manufacturers, lobbyist groups, right? They wrote books for each other and articles, and they had podcasts like we're having today. You would not have had this conversation 200 years ago, even if you had podcast technology, because we wouldn't have known that information was a specific topic. We might have talked about political science, which would have included economics, history, and so on. So it became more differentiated over time and organized.
Yeah. And since you've just referred there to several different scientific disciplines, What is the relationship between information and...
Okay. Information tends to be more specific about a situation than knowledge. Knowledge is normally seen as a collection of these informations. But people also still use the word knowledge as the same as information. Again, we started this conversation by saying there was still tremendous debate about what is information. The last time we talked, a couple of years ago, about fake news, we said that fake facts were pieces of information that were just wrong. So 9 degrees Celsius could have actually been 11, but I told you 9, and it's really 11. And the reason why I told you 11 is because I wanted to sell you a different type of clothing than somebody who is trying to sell you clothing for 9 degree, right? So some people will use knowledge. It was more customary in the first half of the 20th century to use the word knowledge than it is in the second half of the 20th century. And the reason why it changed is that as information became more specialized and therefore organized, people sought a more narrowly defined term, and that's how they began to drift toward information, and then drift even further now toward facts. Because remember, information could be about all manner of weather, and not just simply temperature. Hopefully that helps.
Of course, I guess that we can say that over the course of time, information, and in recent centuries particularly, information grew a lot in terms of the amount of information we have produced.
It's amazing. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we're talking orders of magnitude increase in the number of data. If you go to Google and you Google anything, you Google yourself, and you'll get 1.5 million hits. Well, how much information do we need about Ricardo, right? Do we need 1.5 million? But it'll tell you, 1.5 million. You should do that sometime. You'll be horrified how much information there is out there of you. 100 years ago, there was very little information about you or your family, your grandfather, your great-grandfather. It's just that it's orders of magnitude. So, for example, you see when you read about how much information there is, we really don't know how much information is out there. But everybody has the fun of doing things like saying, the library, U.S. Library of Congress, all the information it has in it, or the British Museum, all of its information that it's accumulated in the last 500 years is created every hour by Ricardo when he puts together a podcast, or somebody that says, well, I can put all the information that we used to take a century to produce, and I can put it in the back of a small truck, a delivery truck. We can create it in an hour, and so everybody plays this game, man. We all do. And it's fun. The point is, it's orders of magnitude. And what's driven that are things like electricity, cheap printing, literacy, the fact that we have our activities, social and economic and business activities, depend so much on knowledge as opposed to manual labor or muscle power. So that's driven all of that, and that just creates more. So if I'm using a hammer, I will probably develop 3 or 4 other hammers of different sizes for 3 or 4 more specialized uses of the hammer. Now imagine that across all jobs, all manner of tools, all manner of information. And it happens. And it has not slowed down.
And so, talking about a different topic, how did information change how industry operates, for example?
The key idea here is the concept of control. With more information about what was going on in different parts of a business that could be communicated quickly, usually by telegraph and telephone and computers and electronics, management could understand what one part of the business was doing versus another part, and therefore coordinate what was happening to do more complex activities, but also to improve the quality of those activities, and also to learn how to drive down the costs of those activities, and also to learn how much they could charge for those activities. And that's what's happened over the last couple of 100 years. And in the process, they also created jobs that answer those questions. That's why you have professors, that's why you have consultants, that's why you have accountants, that's why you have you and I.
Right.
You and I would not have had a job 200 years ago. We would have been growing potatoes.
Yeah.
Or in their country, cork.
Yeah. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what is the role that has been played by governments when it comes to supplying information or any other way by which governments deal with information?
2 points to make here. The first is that governments, since the dawn of time, as far back as we can go in recorded history, have had as their primary job, their day-to-day job, when government officials go to work every morning, to collect and use information. That's what they have done. And that's what they do today. They have always done that. The second thing they have done, therefore, is to promote the collection and use of information. So whether you are in Iran 3,000 years ago, or whether you're Macron or Biden today, you're investing in infrastructure to get more high-speed internet for people, to make sure that there are universities and schools for children. What governments do is to promote the use of information, and they provide facilities for that. They pay for infrastructure. They provide you with tax benefits for investing in information. They pay for schooling. They collect taxes to pay for that. If they did not collect information, you would not need a lot of government, if you think about it. You wouldn't need government at all. You just need the village. And for tens of thousands of years, that's all we had. But the minute they started collecting information, government came into existence beyond the village. So 2 things. One is that their primary job in life is to collect, use information, and number 2 is to do more to invest in infrastructure and promoting the use of information than any other institution in society. The church doesn't do as much, private sector doesn't do as much, and obviously you and I don't do as much.
And so the role of governments, particularly in the information age, if we could call it that, is absolutely crucial, right?
Essential.
Yeah.
It is the most important institution in the development of information. Now, the professors would say, au contraire. I'm a physicist, I'm a chemist, I'm a this. And say, well, wait a minute. You are a government employee in most universities. Most universities are public. Right? Oxford University is a public institution. The professors at Oxford don't like to think of themselves as government employees like the police or the fire, but they're government employees. They are subject to the laws of public administration. And when you tell them that, they go, oh, okay, but don't tell anybody. No? It's a secret, because I'm a professor. I'm not supposed to be a public employee. I'm not a policeman. I'm not a social worker. but they're government employees. And what do they do for a living all day long? They collect, they analyze, they use information. That's all they deal with. You don't see a professor from Oxford University outside digging, putting in trees in the front yard of his classroom. He's in the classroom dealing with information.
And since we're talking about people or institutions that deal with information, what is the role played by librarians?
Libraries have been very crucial. Their role has evolved a lot. In fact, I have a very long chapter in this book about them. Briefly stated, in the 19th century, they could not control the volume of information coming into their libraries. They were out of control. If they had 10,000 books, a librarian knew more or less what he had. But by the 1870s, impossible, because Harvard University had 40,000 books. It was out of control. Same thing with all universities around the world. So they had to develop cataloging systems. So the story of libraries in the second half of the 20th century, in the 19th century, was all about creating catalogs to organize information physically on shelves, but also in catalogs where you could go and say, well, what has been written about steam engines? Mm-hmm. Well, they have a bunch of cards that say steam engines, and so you can see what they have. So they did that, and it was all paper-based, but they went through the logic of laying out what are the 10 major fields or the 20 major fields, so you can see how they were beginning to organize and discipline information. And they kept doing that all through the 20th century. Now, they did hit a crisis with the development of the computer, because the computer people wanted to do the same thing, but the librarians weren't trained in computers. So the computer people did very little talking to the paper-based librarians. Mm-hmm. And in the second half of the 20th century, the computer people developed things like databases and search tools.
Yes.
Google is not a librarian-developed system. Its query functions, everything else is different. And then, of course, in the last quarter of the 20th century, the librarians had to catch up with that. So now you walk into a library, and it's like a cafe, a coffee cafe. And you have terminals all over the place. The old card catalogs are gone. You have universities refuse to take in books anymore. They think everything ought to be e-books and online. And that's a huge debate going on right now, whether they're right or wrong about it. But the point is that the librarians started the process of organizing information in ways that the rest of us could access it. And so their contribution was crucial, absolutely crucial. And it was driven by the increase in the volume of information. And of course, as they began to organize it and to collect journals and magazines and books, that just stimulated the creation of more information. And that's why you have these libraries now that have 10 million volumes or 20 million volumes. And, that's welcome to today.
By the way, since you mentioned there the debate surrounding e-books and physical books, and if we should read one kind of book or the other to supposedly process information better and retain it better, I hadn't planned of asking you this question when I was preparing the interview, but do you have any opinion on that? And I mean, as someone who has been studying information and how information processing has changed over time, and we'll get more into that in a bit. Do you have any opinion on this matter or not?
I do.
Okay.
First, let's begin with a basic statistic. If you go to book publishers who offer you both an e-version and a paper version, they will tell you that 80% of their sales go to paper versions or come from paper versions. The other 20% come from e-versions. If you're reading what we in the United States like to call a beach novel, man falls in love with a woman at a beach on a holiday, an e-book is fine. They read it on the airplane. and it's ephemeral. It's, you know, it's rubbish and eventually goes away, right? On the other hand, if you are a historian or an economist and you're studying the information and you want to collect it, you may want to have a hard copy where you can write notes in the book and put little post-it notes in there saying, you know, come back to this later. You know, so my desk is filled with these things, you know. So there are certain vehicles that are a lot easier to work with. Most people find that holding a volume in their hand is much easier, and they like the three-dimensional quality of it. I do too, personally. I tend to collect articles electronically and to store them electronically, although sometimes I print them out because it's easier to work with. But I also know that if I want a book that will survive for the next 500 years, I will buy it in paper. Because the odds of it surviving right now, as I sit here in 2023, is greater for humankind if it's in paper than if it's the other way around. I personally use both formats, but if it tends to be nonfiction, I tend to favor paper, as do most people. If it's fiction and I'm just enjoying it for like watching a television program, you know, E is fine. And I find that my view is essentially the same as the vast majority of people around the world. Get on the subway. I assume you have a train system in Lisbon. Watch what people read when they go to work in the morning. Some of them will have books or magazines, and others will have their little e-reader or their cell phones.
Right.
And you'll see that there's some generational issues there. You know, the younger ones will probably read the little books on their cell phones. I can't because my eyesight isn't that good. You know, it's not like I'm 20 years old, so I need bigger print. So I might do that on an iPad, or I'll just have my little paperback.
Right.
Yeah. Also, there's a psychological thing. I mean, for example, you can see behind me bookshelves of books. This whole room is surrounded with books. I feel like a mouse in my little underground cave. It's warm, it's friendly. I look at the titles and I'm reminded that I have not read that book up there, and I've been meaning to do that, or it reminds me of, wow, I have a whole shelf about fake books, fake information. So I'm reminded every day of that. Just like you're reminded if you have a photograph of your family on your desk and you see it every day. It's the same psychological effect. You cannot get that from E, but you can get it from paper.
But I mean, do you think that that also has implications when it comes to education? So do you think that if, for example, students, I mean, if you compare students that use more printed papers or printed books versus the digital versions of them, that perhaps the ones who tend to read more printed versions retain more information and better or not?
There's a lot of research that has been done around this question, and some of it depends on how you were trained and where you are in the world. If you take a look at a 5-year-old child, every 5-year-old child you've ever met loves to have books read to them. It's a physical act of intimacy with their mother or father or whoever is reading it. It's a physical act. They're turning the pages, they're looking at the pictures. On the other hand, that child at 25 may be in a hurry to get through a piece of information while they're on an airplane. And therefore, they're going to read it on their electronic device. So it varies depending on the purpose. What we do know, however, is that around the world, it's almost safe to say everybody who has formal school education is taught through the vehicle of books and magazines. And even though they have a lot of electronic information that they collect also, because it's now simultaneous, it's both.
Yeah.
They start out in life with physical objects. And during COVID, when everybody had to go to Zoom, there were a lot of children all over the world that had difficulty learning off of Zoom because they felt more comfortable with the paper object.
Yeah.
Their teachers had the same problem. Now, part of it was mechanical. You know, how do you use Zoom and how do you log on and all that kind of mechanical stuff.
Right.
But then there was the psychological effect. You know, do I see it on a screen or do I feel it better in a book? The psychologists haven't quite declared victory that paper provides a greater impact because it's three-dimensional. So you're not just getting a flat intellectual display of signals. You're also feeling it. There's a three-dimensionality to it. And by the way, this is very important because cultural anthropologists who study culture have long argued that the physical object communicates many things more emphatically. So, for example, I'm now holding up a pen in my hand. We can talk about a pen as an electronic image on a screen, but I'm holding this pen in my hand. It's three-dimensional. It has some weight to it. It's very attractive, very fancy. My wife gave me this, you know. It almost looks like it's made out of wood. And it tells me a great deal. And I'll probably remember this pen more because I have it physically than a picture of it for sale on eBay, for example. So there's that additional feature of the physicality.
Right.
At the same time.
So earlier when I asked you about librarians, at a certain point you mentioned the introduction of the computer, and I would like to ask you now about the role of computer scientists. So with their emergence, in what ways do you think they can contribute to discussions surrounding information?
Their role is very, very important. In fact, so important that when I wrote the book, the chapter after the librarians was about exactly this community, because you're absolutely right. They are reshaping information in several ways. The obvious one is that they've made a lot more information available to anybody, cheap and fast. And they invented devices and software that collect vast amounts of information quickly and fast, and different information. So you would not have had, in 1925, you would not have had somebody on the side of a road counting how many cars were going by. But today, you have sensors that can tell you that 140,000 cars went by your house in the last 24 hours, and that is up or down based on what happened yesterday, the day before, and they can also forecast how many cars are going to go by your house tomorrow if it's raining or snowing or if it's sunny. That's what the technology allowed them to, first thing they allowed them to do. The second thing it allowed them to do was then to do what the librarians had done, is to organize information in even more subcategories. So we could get it down to a subcategory of one, Ricardo. Organize all the information in the world about Ricardo quickly and keep feeding me that information every day. I want to know every day what Ricardo did yesterday. That's a file of one, right? And that's where, and you'd be horrified at how much information is gathered on you. Probably 6,000 to 10,000 pieces of information are gathered on you every day that you're not even aware of. Oh yeah. Just look at your cell phone. Just look at your Google searches. Look at what you do on Facebook. How many keystrokes you hit on your terminal. How much time you spend on the system, and so on. So they were able to develop greater amounts of information. Philosophically, they've had to deal with how do we organize and access information. And they're the ones who came up with the concept of databases.
Mm-hmm.
If you have, you search at one level, it'll take you down, much like a family genealogy, to several other categories, then below that, more categories.
Yeah.
That's their contribution. Now, on the one hand, they created more subdivisions of information, which became a huge problem in the 20th century. And now what they're doing is they're developing tools that allow you to bring it all back together in more integrated forms. So if I want to know about Ricardo, I used to have to find out how much money he made, who is he married to, where does he live, does he have a driver's license for his automobile, does he pay his taxes? In other words, 5 different collections of information. I had to go to 5 different places. Mm-hmm. And all I knew was that, and I would have to form in my mind a composite view of what is Ricardo like as a human being. Mm-hmm. Now we're getting software that allows us to pull that together, and pretty soon all the new forms of AI will allow us to say, well, you know, all this information tells us that Ricardo's a good guy. He pays his bills, he pays his taxes, he doesn't beat up anybody in his family, he obeys the law when it comes to driving his car, he spends too much time watching television, and but he's an interesting guy because he talks to all these very interesting people, and he's very useful for certain types of information, but he doesn't know anything about these other types of information. So you can see that what the computer people have done is integrated that. The big fear today is that we will not need Ricardo in the future, right? Everybody's afraid that, well, we'll just have software do this. We'll replace Ricardo, you know, and then, you know, the global environment can go cold or hot. It doesn't matter because Ricardo won't be around. The computers will be the next thing, and Ricardo will have been part of the human race, which died out with the dinosaurs. The cockroaches will still be here because they've been here for 250 million years, and now we'll have artificial intelligence ruling the world.
Yeah, well, we might get back to that point later on. But I mean, a group of people that you also talk about in the book, and we haven't mentioned here yet, is the statisticians. So what is their role today, and in what ways does statistics change the way information is processed and presented?
Okay. As human beings got into using what we call the scientific approach to collecting methodically information beginning in the 1600s, they needed precision, right? So we're back to our temperature of 9 degrees versus 11 degrees. Mm-hmm. And mathematics helped with that and gave them a confidence that it allowed them to be a little bit more precise in something. So, you know, 2 is not as much as 4, 4 is not as much as 8. So it gave them precision, which allowed them to do more things that required precision. That meant that mathematics not only become more popular, but could be developed as a subject in itself, like history or political science. Mm-hmm. So all through the 18th century and the 19th century, and deep into the 20th century, there's an enormous amount of work done to develop mathematics beyond the 4 functions of adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing. So you got algebra, calculus, vector analysis, all that kind of stuff. And within that, there was a subgroup that we now call statistics. Now, the interesting thing about statistics is that it's a collection of numbers that tell you something that you cannot know otherwise. Remember, we talked a little bit earlier about businesses wanting to control. Mm-hmm. One of the things that you would ask as a businessman is, how much cork did I sell this month versus last month? And given the fact that I harvest my crop in September or August, I forget which month it is, and I sell it in November, given the weather, what are the chances that I'll sell the same amount next year? That's the tool of the statistician. And during the 20th century, that developed almost into its own field of information. And the body of information that they have created, the methods that they use, are oftentimes quite different than algebraic or calculus or other more traditional forms of mathematics. You can get a university degree in statistics and maybe only take 1 or 2 mathematics courses. You can do that. In fact, when I was working at IBM, we used to have 1-week training programs on statistics, on how to use statistics, and they didn't care whether you knew algebra or calculus. They never mentioned those terms. They just got into the subfield. All you needed to know was how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and also to use an Excel spreadsheet. It was more important that you know what a number looks like and how to use an Excel spreadsheet than to have the concepts. Because one of the things that happened was that statisticians developed methods for comparing data, and then they wrote software to do that analysis for you. So you just go into your phone or Excel spreadsheet on your laptop and say, well, I need a correlation analysis of such and such and such. And it does it for you. And it can do trend analysis. It can do probability analysis. And they've gotten better at it. And they now use it for so many other interesting things. For example, when you go to Google and say, translate obrigado, a nice, polite Portuguese word for thank you, into say, English or French or something else. Do you think Google knows all those languages? No. What Google does is it goes in and says, compare obrigado to similar ideas in French, German, Spanish, whatever it is, and tell me what the probability is that, for example, obrigado means thank you in English. And what the statistician in the computer will say is there's a 99% chance, or 95 to 99% chance that obrigado means thank you. Now, you and I don't care about the statistic. All we want to know is, and what Google gives us is, obrigado means thank you. It's like the old consultant's joke. You know, you go to a consultant and you say, what time is it? All you want to know is what time it is. A bad consultant will come along and say, I'm glad you asked, because I have this Rolex watch. And you know, I got to tell you, the science behind this Rolex watch is fantastic. In fact, let me open it up and show you the gears in here. The first of these gears were invented in the 1600s, and they really improved it. And then the Japanese came along with batteries. And you're going, please, just tell me what time it is. So that's what Google does. It tells you that obrigado means thank you. But it arrives at it by using the tools of the statistician, because they give you trends, they give you odds, and therefore they give you predictability. So you no longer have to be like the Greek general of ancient Greece who goes to the temple and asks the priest there to look at pigeon poo-poo to see whether he's going to win the next battle or not. That's what's happened.
Yeah. So let me ask you now, we've talked about statistics, let me ask you now about science and the scientific method. So do you think that studying and understanding how information works and is processed can also help us get a better understanding of how science itself works?
Yes, it's a virtuous circle, a loop. When you create new information using what they call scientific methods, because there are many of them, and there's a lot of debate as to what that means.
Yeah.
We could spend hours talking about them.
Yeah, it's better to have that sort of discussion perhaps with a philosopher of science.
Or, a chemist has a different definition than a physicist and so on.
Yeah.
But the point is, the scientific methods, if we use a plural term, provides various techniques for creating information that tell you what reality looks like, or that can create new realities, right?
Right.
And you apply it, okay? And then you learn from that, and then you do more of it. So the whole notion of the scientific method is that it facilitates the creation of more information and the discovery of information about reality. So black holes in space, they exist because they were able to discover it. And you might say, well, they model it. We really haven't seen it. I haven't touched it. Like in the Bible it says, the doubting Thomas, put your finger in the hole of Christ's hand, and then you believe. So we have physicists who say, well, maybe there are black holes out there. Or we calculate it based on radio signals and so on. But if you're confident in your use of the scientific methods for doing this, you absolutely believe that there are black holes out there as much as you believe that there is a pen in my hand that's physical and it has a certain weight and body to it. So that's what the scientific method has done with information. Now, the problem here is that as you go through that, it becomes more sophisticated and elegant and diverse. You have the same conversations that we started this whole meeting with about, well, what's the definition of information and how accurate is it? And every discipline has that debate, and every new discipline has that debate because we have new disciplines created all the time. In our lifetime, for example, astronomy went to the whole notion of space travel and what have you, and all the physics of space travel. We didn't have that conversation in the 1930s, right? 100 years later, right? Here we are. We're having that conversation. Artificial intelligence was always a fiction. Now it's people are going, oh, this is actually real. We could become the next set of dinosaurs, So you see how it evolved. Now, one of the things I did in this book is I, on purpose, did not get into the debates for each of the disciplines. In fact, let me make a general observation, and that is, when I started studying the modern uses of information, I reached two conclusions. One is there was a lot more information developed in the last 200 years than ever before. And then secondly, it was so divided up into different categories that we probably needed to look at clusters of information, much like flavors of ice cream, chocolate ice cream, vanilla ice cream, strawberry ice cream, so on. So I studied it that way, and the book reflects that. I mean, you got a chapter on librarians, another on computer scientists, another on economists, another on political scientists, so another on business, so the obvious categories. But within each of those is you have this subculture and debates about what constitutes a scientific approach, what is truth, what isn't truth, what can you believe, not believe, and how can you use the information. And it creates crises. I mean, for example, right now, physicists are arguing among themselves, is there a universal theory about everything? Mm-hmm. Oh, gosh, this is the same conversation that the Catholic Church had 2,000 years ago. Back to it. And I'm glad I'm not the Pope. Because now I got competition. I got competition from the physicists.
Yeah.
No, so the point is that within these disciplines you have different things. On the other hand, chemists are in a better situation because when they describe a chemical element or a rock or whatever, its features haven't changed. So if you wrote a paper describing what granite looked like in 1870, you can still read that paper today, and if the describer, the author, was competent and accurate at the time, it's still accurate and competent today.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So now the chemist, to be sexy, has to go borrow some tools from the statistician or the physicist that says, well, if I melt this rock down, can I make a different something?
Right.
Welcome to the world of complexity and chaos.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Pope there at a certain point, and perhaps we can make all of that less complex if we just accept that since at least the 19th century, the Pope has been considered by the Church as officially infallible. So wherever he says, supposedly.
And the historians would tell you that was a magnificent political move, but not necessarily a theological one. Although it was sold that way, obviously.
Yeah.
But even the current Pope, you know, he says, who am I to judge?
Yeah.
So he may have compromised the infallibility argument by acting like an honest man, saying, who am I to judge whether you're a good person or not? Whereas the Pope in the 19th century, Pope Pius, would have said, Ricardo, if you do the following three things, you're a good guy. If you don't, you're a bad guy. And oh, by the way, I got it from God. So, you know, from me to you. So, you know, the culture has changed. And the scientific approach would say, well, there are many ways to judge Ricardo's behavior.
Yeah.
And the Pope recognizes that.
And I guess that, of course, we won't get into the huge, never-ending debate about the scientific method and if there are many different scientific methods out there, but we can get at least into some, or at least a couple of different scientific disciplines, and one of them that you cover in the book is economics. So why is economics so important today when it comes to understanding information?
I think there are a couple of reasons for it. I mean, there's always been interest in economics. In the 18th century, 19th century, people wrote books about economics, and it gives you insight. As mathematics and statistics, as disciplines provided more information, it became more possible to describe activities that generate money, that generate profit. And those were always conversations that were held in the language of mathematics. Mm-hmm. And this is a good time to say that mathematics is more than a discipline, it's also a language. So we're going to have a conversation about language. It has its verbs, its nouns, its grammar. Mm-hmm. And it provides a whole body of information about activities. And since economics is all about precision, as mathematics and statistics became more usable and practical, it made economics more fashionable. So you could, for example, in the 19th century, you could, in economics, say, well, if you make something that people want, they will have a tendency to buy it, providing they can afford it. Right? You could just say it in English that way. But today, you'd have to say, if I make a computer chip and it costs 1/10 of a euro, I cannot sell that because the person who needs to buy it needs to have it at 1/20th of a euro. So how do I get from 1/10 to 1/20th? And if I get down to 1/20th, how many of these can I sell, and how many do I need to sell in order to be able to pay for a €9 billion factory to make, and I got to make my money back in 3 to 5 years, right? So that was very important. The second thing that happened was that beginning even before Karl Marx, but after Karl Marx, governments and societies increasingly expected governments to facilitate economic development. As governments became either more imperial, taking over and creating new colonies in Africa and Asia and so on, or because the complexity of the technology such as steam and electricity and so on required bigger investments. So governments began to be required to help facilitate economic development, increasing quality of life, and so economics became the vehicle for a lot of that. So today we can talk about consumer price indices, GDP, economic development. You have the OECD in Europe. You have the IMF investing in underdeveloped countries. And by the way, the definition of underdeveloped country is so arrogant. It's a country that doesn't operate like Portugal or France. You know, and you go, well, I don't know. There's some villages in Guatemala that you would consider underdeveloped, but the people are happy, and they're eating well, and they have time to play soccer.
Right.
What's wrong with that? You know, happiness at the end of the day is what you want to go through life with, right? So, but they're underdeveloped. You know, so you can see that economics became a way of defining society and its aspirations and providing information that allows things to be done using information as a tool. So economic information is a tool. It's an object. Every week, your newspaper and your media in whatever country you're in will announce that, you know, unemployment is up, it's down, inflation is this, it's that. And if inflation is high, then everybody gets mad at Macron or used to get mad at
Antonio Costa here in Portugal, for example.
Oh yeah, exactly. You get mad. Who do you get mad at? You get mad at your government, and you know, and whoever's running your government at any time says, wait a minute, it's not my fault. You know, I have the same problem when I go and I buy an orange. You know, it's expensive for me too, but you know, he gets blamed for it. So, but economics is a tool, and everybody uses it.
And and I mean, you've just mentioned politicians there. So how about political scientists? What kinds of information do they really deal with, and what is basically their role?
Okay. The argument I make in this book about political scientists is that they use information the way historians do, and economists and physicists and so on. They look at probability. They look at trends, and then they translate those trends not only into numbers but also descriptions. You know, Ricardo has been eating more ice cream over the last 20 years, and people who eat more ice cream over the last 20 years are becoming more politically liberal. That's political scientists, right? But the thing that political scientists have done more than anything else is they have developed the concept of polling. And that relies a lot on mathematics and statistics. We went out and were able to determine the political attitudes of the French toward retirement being increased by 2 years by interviewing the right 1,500 Frenchmen, even though there are tens of millions of Frenchmen. We know today, based on polling techniques, which are based on statistics, that we get to the right 1,500 people, we can tell Macron what people think about his idea to improve retirement by deferring it by 2 years. That's what a politician wants, and that's what a political scientist has developed, and it's enormous value there. You cannot go, I think, a day without reading in news media polls. Now, the polling methods, came from different sources, sociology, economics, and so on, but the people who really took it to the next level were political scientists, and then other disciplines copied the polling techniques and methods of the statistician and of the political scientist. And now you see it for everything. How many people are eating paella in Spain or butifarra in Barcelona or hot dogs in the United States. So, everybody's doing it. And you can thank the political scientists. That's been their. Now, they would argue that they've done a lot of other things, but the other thing they've done is what everybody else has done, which is they now measure and study more topics that they call political science than they would have 2 centuries ago. They don't study economics as much as they did in the 1700s, when political science and economics were really one subject. The librarians in the 19th century broke that into 2 subjects. In the 20th century, everybody got their PhDs in 2 separate fields. And then they developed methods and subject areas in the journals and so on. They don't talk to each other as much as they should. And now you got modeling software that's trying to bring it back together again. And so you get a narrative conversation with less statistics. So you can see this cycle. It happens all. But political science is one of those. But I would say polling was, if I had to pick one thing they did, was polling.
And earlier I've asked you about the role that governments play in processing and supplying information. And I guess that just to not annoy the libertarians too much, what is the role played by businesses?
Well, businesses do the same thing governments do. They use information the same way. Either they borrow information from the government and use it for their own work, or they use the same methods the government does. Here's an example of borrowing. Most weather reports that you see on television every night are developed by governments. Because they have all the sensors all over the world and they can tell you what the temperature is going to be, and they develop the methods for studying whether the temperature is going to go up, it's going to go down, it's going to rain, and so on. And by the way, they use statistics, right? There's a 30% chance it's going to rain in Lisbon tomorrow. There's statistics at work. Right. So if you are a farmer, you're a capitalist pig, right? You're a farmer, but you got to know what the weather is. So you rely on government data, but then you go down to your bodega and complain, oh, government in Portugal is too invasive in my life. They're telling me everything I have to do.
They're socialists.
They're big socialists. They want to take over everything, and they tax me too much and everything else. Oh, by the way, did you know that it's going to be the 30% chance of rain tomorrow? So, so you have this discontinuity. So business uses it. But at the same time, government also borrows from business. So government will survey unemployment, for example. So my company fires a bunch of people because they don't need them anymore. And we do it because that's the right thing to do to make profit, or we're going into another business. But then the government will keep score. Like a good football game. Oh, Lisbon just beat Madrid 2-1. Great. The national champions, what have you. So each one borrows from the other. Each one uses the same techniques as the other, and each one for their own purposes. And some of those purposes are actually mutual. So, for example, whenever there's a recession, governments will try and help businesses recover. by providing unemployment insurance or putting out contracts for infrastructure to build highways and more internet, so the companies that build highways and internet now have demand for their products. So in that sense, that works, and each one works on the other. The Chinese government, I think, does a very good job in using state power to encourage and develop private sector power, more so than, say, the United States, which thinks that philosophically they should be separate, but that's a fiction. In reality, they're intimately tied, and you see it in Europe. The Europeans do a very good job in trying to collaborate between private and public sector more than in other countries. But in each country, you'll have people on the right say, oh, government is terrible, we got too much of it, and then people on the left saying there's not enough of it. And usually the problem is that they have different definitions of what would be more effective. Right. And that's your arguments, and always have.
Mm-hmm. And so in our first conversation, we talked about your book, Fake News Nation, and so a lot about misinformation. So since this book is about information, how does it tie to misinformation and how we understand it?
Well, we can have more of it. For all the reasons that we have good information, we also can make just as much or more bad information. Yeah. And as we talked about a couple of years ago, the two reasons that we could have more information is because you and I can put rubbish out there, because they're no longer just the experts, to make sure that the information isn't poisonous. I mean, you can make bad food, just as easily, as the experts. And that's thanks to the computer people. I can go out on Facebook or LinkedIn or on your blog and just put all kinds of rubbish out there. And it's easy, it's cost effective, everybody can go out there without any discipline. So we produce more of it, and certainly that hasn't changed since I wrote the last book. But we also have become more aware that there's bad information out there. And the big argument that, for example, EU regulators are having with people like Facebook is that you're not doing enough to discriminate between bad information and good information. And by the way, this is a serious problem. During COVID, and I'm going to use an American example, the administration under President Trump discounted the seriousness of COVID and also put out ridiculous cures, suggestions of cures. Mm-hmm. At the same time that they were developing a real vaccine. Okay?
Yes.
It's been estimated by government officials that 150,000 people died in the United States because they believed the rubbish that came from the Republican Party in the United States. Mm-hmm. Those 150,000 people did not need to die had they gone out and gotten the vaccine. They would have gotten sick maybe, but they might not have died. Mm-hmm. 1 million people died in the United States for different reasons, bad preparation on the part of the government and not having a, vaccine and so on. It's a normal causes. But 150,000 people died because they believed bad information. Mm-hmm. And many of them, their stories were told in the newspapers saying, oh, had I known, as they're dying on their bed in the hospital, oh, if I had known, I would have gotten my vaccine. Oh, gee, is it too late? Yeah, it's too late. Sorry, you're going to be dead in the next 48 hours. There's nothing we can do. So 150,000 people died. And who knows, there may be even more. And it's probably true in other nations. So bad information has consequences. You cannot violate the laws of physics and chemistry and biology. There's just the natural order of things, right? So, but then, of course, bad information can be mild. You buy a piece of fruit that is, you should have bought the one next to it because it's fresher than the one that's
Yeah.
it's for sale. It's better for you because you can now buy this piece of fruit for €3, whereas this other one costs you €4. Why is the one with €4? Well, it's because it's fresher. The one with €3 is because it's beginning to rot. But they sell that to you as, it's a bargain. €3 instead of 4. Of course, you're going to buy the 3, right? So fake misinformation is still out there, but we're getting more tools and more awareness. The average person on the street is becoming more sensitized to the issue, and they're learning ways of trying to mitigate, to discriminate between misinformation and useful information. Are they where they need to be? Of course not. It's a form of illiteracy that we face today, our inability to discriminate. And by the way, you and I know a lot about information, but you and I also get misinformation sent to us that we believe.
Sure.
It happens. And I find it embarrassing sometimes. And I go, oh, gee. As the Bible says, I have feet of clay.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. And by the way, you mentioned information literacy there, but do you think that by understanding how information works, as you try to do in the book to a certain extent, we can also perhaps come up with new solutions to, for example, prevent the spread of misinformation? Do you think that, for example, we would need more regulation of social media or something like that?
I believe we need a number of things. Mm-hmm. Let's begin with a very American concept, personal responsibility. You and I as individuals must learn to discriminate between fake facts and creditable facts, things that we should be taking action on. Otherwise, we become one of those 150,000 people. Right? Mm-hmm. So we have a personal responsibility. And by the way, I believe that personal responsibility applies all over the world. Every religion that you've ever seen speaks to the issue of personal responsibility. It begins with the individual. And that personal responsibility is to teach your children, to inform your family, and to assist your society at the individual level. That's the point. The second point is there are economies of scale and efficiency that can be done at the institutional level. If you go to Facebook and say you are not allowed to post any information that is scientifically not true, and if you do, we will give you a fine, or we're going to send Mr. Zuckerberg to jail, or what have you. We have laws in Europe and in the United States, for example, that prohibit a company from putting out fake information about their sales. Mm-hmm. And you have to sign a form saying that my annual report is true, and if it's false, then you can go to jail. And in this country and in Europe, you actually send people to jail for that. And if you hide the information or mislead, you have this problem where you have liability, personal liability, as well as institutional liability, as you saw with what happened with Volkswagen and the diesel reports. Okay, so there's valuable regulatory activity that ought to be implemented to block a lot of information. Say, for example, going on Facebook about COVID. That's bad. Just eliminate it. It just reduces the volume of work that an individual has to do. Mm-hmm. So you're not an expert on everything. So if somebody comes up with a cure for COVID, you're not in a position to determine whether that's a legitimate cure. Mm-hmm. You just don't know. I mean, if I come to you and say, eat onions with ketchup on it, and I have a fake, University of Paris, a medical school says, do this, how are you to judge that? It may be true,
Yeah.
but you don't know. But you say, well, it's the University of Paris, so I'm going to start eating onions with ketchup on it, and I'm going to be cured. But the problem is that you can't be a judge of that. However, the French government could tell universities, do not put out rubbish,
Yeah.
because then we're going to stop paying for your medical school, and we're going to fire, dismiss the president of the University of Paris, because he's got a crazy doctor putting out stupid information. So there's an efficiency there and an effectiveness there that regulatory things can do. And by the way, today, the European regulatory bodies are doing a better job than anybody else in the world in trying to figure out what to regulate with respect to misinformation versus accurate information. And by the way, they don't have the answers because the technology keeps changing, and now with all the new changes in AI that are coming along, everybody's scratching their head and they're pulling their hair out trying to figure this one out. So I feel sorry for them. But what the European regulators understand very well is that they can do positive good on a regulatory basis. And secondly, more important perhaps now, they can do it faster than governments in other countries. They're not quite at the same speed as the evolution of technology, but they're not as slow as the United States, Japan, or China, or some of these other countries. It's an interesting phenomenon. In fact, if you have not done so, you probably ought to interview some of the EU regulators to understand what they're going through, not what they're doing so much, but to understand what are the intellectual problems they're facing. Why can't they come out this afternoon with a set of regulations? Do this, do that, don't do that. Because they're struggling with it just the way a philosopher would struggle with what is truth and how much should you have and not have. It's not about censorship. And I want to make this point very strong. The conversation isn't about censorship. It may be in China where they say we don't want you to criticize the government and so on. You see authoritarian regimes. You'll see it in Russia, Hungary, and obvious places. No, the regulators are struggling with exactly the issue you and I are worried about, and that is truth versus not truth. And in liberal, open societies, democratic societies, you want more truth rather than less, philosophically. But you know that you can kill 150,000 people if you let misinformation float around.
Yeah.
Death, tension.
And I guess this is a related issue to some extent, but what are your views on big data? Because sometimes it's sold as the way of, I don't know, accelerating the production of scientific knowledge, for example, but can't it also be problematic in some ways? I mean, just relying on big data itself to produce knowledge.
Big data has its value in the sense of, because of software, we can aggregate a lot of information together. There's new insights.
Yeah.
Go back to the little meter on the road in front of your house. That can tell you that 140,000 people drove by your house. That's a different piece of information. That's big data. 10 years ago, that would not have been the case. But with that piece of information, when your community refurbishes your road in front, they may do it differently than they would have 10 years ago to make it easier, faster, safer because of that, right? Just putting a pavement down that doesn't bounce off the road as much noise as would have been the asphalt they put down on your road 20 years ago, because you wanted to be quieter. Okay, so that's a good example of big data. On the other hand, big data may not get you to the detail you need to take action. Big data will tell us that, statistically speaking, 150,000 people died because they believed Trump's silly comments about drinking bleach or whatever it is, and they died. Okay,
Yeah.
that's a big data piece of information. However, that doesn't tell you why they believed Trump, or why they know from prior to COVID that bleach is dangerous. You don't drink bleach. You knew that as an adult. You learned as a child. You don't drink bleach. It'll rip your stomach apart. So why did they do it? I mean, it's a ridiculous example, but because not all 150,000 people drank bleach. But big data would mislead you to thinking, well, all Republicans, all these people who died lived in those parts of the United States that voted for Trump in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? That's big data talking. But then you go down and you talk to the individuals, and you're going to get a different story. If you talk to the widow of why did your husband die? Well, he voted for Trump. He thought, he's a libertarian. He didn't pay attention. He was looking for the quick fix. There wasn't a cure, and yet he's a man who went through life solving problems. So now you begin to get a subtlety there that allows you then to say, well, for the next pandemic, mm-hmm. we know we're going to have 150,000 people that are going to die unless we do something different. Mm-hmm. So maybe the conclusion there is that people who are used to taking charge of their lives and finding solutions and somebody else doesn't have one for them are actually at risk. In our culture, in the United States, a person who is willing to take charge and solve problems is considered a noble human being. But that nobility of purpose, because they're liable to make a bad decision with bad facts, and they're going to drink bleach or take those horse pills that are being promoted for a long time. Because he's a farmer, he says, well, it works on my horse, so yeah, maybe if I cut the pill in half, so because I'm half the size of a horse, it'll work for me. Makes perfect sense. So you do it and you die. So you need more finite data, and so trying to figure out when you need finite data versus big data is always a problem, and it's different in every discipline. Medicine versus physics versus economics. So there are limits to big data. But big data tells us 140,000 people drove by your house, that 150,000 people did something silly. So there you are. And we have black holes because of big data.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, at least that's positive, I guess. So we've already mentioned artificial intelligence here several times, but I would like to ask you a more specific question because, of course, people are worried regarding GPT-4, for example, about the potential of exponentially putting out there more and more misinformation on the internet that is even more convincing than perhaps some of the misinformation put out by humans themselves. But I'm also interested in another kind of potential issue. So certain people, we participate in our society as also information suppliers and people who process information. So do you think that there's a risk that as AI systems keep developing and getting better, that when it comes to information processing, humans could become obsolete?
discussion around this. There has been really for about 30 years. Some of your listeners might think of it as the singularity.
Yeah.
The idea that there's this larger intelligence. Theoretically, yes, of course. The real issue then becomes, what is intelligence? When does it occur? And you got a lot of people out there saying, "Oh, it's going to happen. It's going to happen." You have a lot of people out there saying it's going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, 50 years.
Yeah.
My feeling is that we've got a couple problems to get through. One is every time there's an innovation in computer technology, there's an enormous amount of hype, over-exaggeration about the capabilities that are either existing or coming, and the speed with which they are coming. Okay, so it's three things.
Yeah.
Right, those three things: speed at which it's coming, its capabilities, and it's how it's going to be applied. And the problem here is that depending on where you are in the conversation, you're participating in ways that may not be helpful. So, for example, if you're Microsoft, you are going to push this technology as far as you can, as fast as you can, to use it as a tool.
Right.
To handle payroll or personnel problems, or to seek information that is relevant to you. Okay? You're going to push it as hard as you can, as fast as you can, both legally and technologically. You're going to do that because it's good business, right? That's why you have computers in the first place. Then you have the scientist or the philosopher or people like me who say, yeah, we got to be careful that we don't push out the technology too far, too fast, because they'll do a very good job by accident in putting out misinformation. And that's what's going on right now. You can see a lot of students put together reports, and all the footnotes, citations are fake. The reports didn't exist. So it's yet the text looks good. One of my grandsons tried it, and he produced a paper complete with scholarly citations and everything else. It was all rubbish. But we did that together. It's a test. So can you do it today? Yes, absolutely. You can put out a magnificent paper. It reads very well. Put my name on it. It says James Cortada wrote this paper, and and so there's a risk to me as a writer, obviously, but. So the technology is increasingly getting very good at producing that kind of material. So we have to figure out how to make it creditable. It's the same information conversation. I had a friend of mine when I was a university student 50 years ago who wanted to test, we didn't call it misinformation in those days, but we had a course where we had to write a paper on the philosophy of a particular historian. Every university student gets a PhD in history has to write a paper like that. So he wrote a paper about a fake professor who was teaching at Oxford University in the 19th century. And he wrote this paper about his philosophy on history and his research. All the footnotes were fake. Books in 19 and what have you. And he got a magnificent grade for it. The professor refusing to acknowledge or admit that it was a fake until my friend went to the professor after he had gotten a high mark on the paper and said, I did an experiment, and you may punish me for it, but I wanted to do an experiment. And he wrote this paper more to demonstrate how you could write historiographical papers, philosophy papers. And the professor forgave him for the crime because he did it so well. Okay? That was 50 years ago. Today, AI can do that, and everybody's all excited and fearful of that. I think what you're going to see is that the hype will continue. Microsoft and Google and everybody else will continue to produce new tools. They'll be implemented in a incremental, discriminatory fashion by businesses and governments, and certainly by my grandson, based on the experience he had 2 weeks ago. You know? He's going to pick and choose when he uses it as an augmentation of what he has. And as to when this technology will be smarter than people, I have no idea, and anybody who thinks they do are silly, and that's because what the brain scientists are teaching us is that there is no one definition of intelligence. You and I know people who have not gone to university, but they can fix any engine in your life.
Yes.
And they're not trained on it. You just know they're good at it. You know, they're just you know, that coffee machine in your house that doesn't work right. You know, that you bought in Italy for 2,000 euros. You know, they can fix it.
Yeah.
Even though they've never seen a 2,000 euro coffee machine from Italy in Portugal, they can fix it. That's an Einstein, right?
Yeah.
But ask that same person to talk about gravity, or you know, balance his checking account at the bank. He's ignorant. You know, can't even speak Portuguese properly. You know. Then there are other people that can read a room. You know, my father could walk into a room of strangers, and within minutes he would understand that this guy's an idiot, this guy's smart, this guy is good about this guy's, you know, he could read people. That's a high form of intelligence. Now, he didn't learn that as a university student. I don't know how he learned it. Maybe he learned it from his mother, his father, or who knows. But you and I know people like that.
Yes.
That go to them and you say, well, what do you think of Ricardo? And they'll give you a spot on. So there are about six different forms of intelligence that have been recognized so far by brain scientists. We haven't heard the conversation about artificial intelligence within that context. And since you're going to measure artificial intelligence against humans, you better take those 6, and maybe there are more, you know, there might be 8 or 10. And how do you measure that against artificial intelligence? That hasn't been done yet, right?
Nope.
But that's to be done next. And you may find that artificial intelligence, like big data and Google searches and so on, are very good at some things and very bad at others. So, for example, computers are very good at looking at 10 billion pieces of information and coming up with an answer. You and I can't do that. What we do is we process patterns. We say, well, okay, I can only use 6 pieces of information because I'm not smart enough to hold 10 billion. But I can take 6 pieces of information and come up with the same conclusion as, you know. So it's easier for me to learn Spanish and translate obrigado into, you know, gracias. But the computer can't do that. He's got to look at every piece of literature that's ever been written in Portuguese and in Spanish to come up with that answer. And even then, there's a 95 to 98% chance that obrigado means gracias.
Yeah.
So who's smarter?
Yeah, those are really interesting questions to leave on the table. Let me ask you one final question then. So, when it comes to the history of information and the history of the evolution of information, what do you think are some of the most interesting understudied questions there?
Historians are looking at how people use information in different periods, because they've already come to the conclusion that everybody always lived in an information age.
Yeah.
You know, saying that we live in an information age today is rubbish. They did it in the 1700s. They were doing it in Portugal in the 1300s. There were Indians running around in the United States before Christopher Columbus were using information. And they were codifying it and they were transmitting it. They may not have put it in a book, but they certainly told their children about it. Right?
Yes.
And it ran all the way from wisdom and knowledge to information to data. and datum, if you want, a fact. That's a dead squirrel over there. That's a piece of datum, right? Or all the squirrels are dying. That's data. Information is that we got a problem and we're going to have to move to another part of the United States because the cowboys and the cavalry are coming after us. So they're documenting that. They're trying to also understand how people acquired information and then transmitted it and codified it. So they're doing that, and they're doing it across all societies and all times. So this is activity that's going on. So they're asking, how are you using it? How do you collect it? What kind? And how did it influence your behavior? Those are the fundamental questions. And of course, they're having ugly arguments among themselves as to what is the definition of information and so on. The same arguments that the physicists are having and what have you. Mm-hmm. But historians also try not to get into the conversation about using information to predict things. Every other discipline uses information to predict. That's why people want it, right? So the reason why you like economics is because you want to know, well, if I sell, cork screws for wine bottles, what are the chances that I'm going to sell more or less next year? That's what you want from the economist. You want that prediction. No historian is going to do that because he knows there are too many variables that can get in the way. Weather, maybe Putin invades Portugal and messes up the agricultural products. You have no idea. Or a meteor blows up Lisbon. You have no idea. So the historian will not do that. So don't look to the historians for prediction. This is why they also have a very difficult time when people say, well, tell me lessons learned. What does history teach us? You've heard that phrase.
Yes.
They're looking for predictions. What the historians are looking for when they study history of information is what kind of information gives you context. Context informs decision making. Let me give you one simple example because I know we're probably running out of time. When you go to the beach, you see waves hitting the shore all the time. And the economist would be asked, well, what's going to be the size of the next wave hitting the shore? Is it going to be this tall, this tall? And the economist will probably, you get three economists, they'll give you three different answers as to the size of the wave hitting the shore. The historian will say, no, what we know is that waves hit the shore on a regular basis. That you can count on some of the waves coming in deeper and some shallower. So if you're with your child building a fort on the beach, keep that in mind because you may want to build the fort, 2 meters deeper into where the sand is. But then, of course, at that point, the political scientist comes in or the sociologist and says, but that means that some of the sand is going to be drier than wetter, and you really need wet sand in order to. And the businessman will come along and says, I tell you what, do it on the drier side, but we'll bring in buckets of wet sand to pad around the fort so the child can build a fort that's probably safer than drawing it closer to where the waves come in. And then the statistician will say the chances are that it's going to be better or worse if you move it 1 meter back or 2 meters back. So the historian is giving you the context. I don't know if that helps, but
no, that certainly helps. And okay, so the book is again Birth of Modern Facts: How the Information Revolution Transformed Academic Research, Governments and Businesses. I'm leaving a link to it in the description box of this interview. And Dr. Cortada, just before we go apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, I post comments on my various publications, usually on LinkedIn, one place. I also make it a point to publish in the scholarly literature as well. I also am promoted through the Charles Babbage Institute at the University of Minnesota to announce uh, what I'm publishing and when.
Yeah.
Of course, there are the publications themselves to go through, and you can get them wherever people buy their books. The one point I would like to make is that I don't just write for a scholarly audience. I write for my neighbors and for the lady down the street, and I think that's important because a lot of this information has to be used in a wider society. So my apologies if I use an academic term here and there, but I try to define those.
Hmm.
And the rule of thumb is if everybody in my family can read it, and not everybody has a PhD in history, if they can read it and understand it, then I've done my job.
Yeah, and I think you did a fantastic job with this book and also with the other one we talked about last time, Fake News Nation. So thank you so much for the work you've been doing and thank you for coming back on the show.
Thank you.
Okay, so other one we talked about last time, Fake News Nation. So thank you so much for the work you've been doing and thank you for coming back on the show.
Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please do not forget to like it, share, comment and subscribe. And if you like more generally what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You have all of the links in the description of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreff, Francis Ford, Tiago Dunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Weira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hallman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eklund, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Olsen, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Holt Ericbun, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Neeson, Chris Story, Manuel Oliveira, Kimberly Johnson, and Benjamin Galbart. A special thanks to my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.